Exorcist monk's final fight with the ghost. In the dead of night, under the dim glow of the moon, two mischievous young men, Clay and Martin, are captivated by the ethereal beauty of Daisy, the daughter of a reclusive old man known for his sinister reputation. Their secretive spying leads to a horrifying encounter that uncovers dark, supernatural forces lurking in the shadows of the village. What begins as a light-hearted attempt at romance spirals into a tale of curses, vengeful spirits, and the malevolent secrets of Daisy's family. This chilling, emotionally charged tale unravels in 10 suspenseful minutes, blending fear, drama, and a haunting lesson about meddling in the unknown. Part 1. The Alluring Glow. The moon hung low in the night sky, its pale light spilling over the small village like a shroud of mystery. The soft chirping of crickets was the only sound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. Clay and Martin crouched low behind the hibiscus hedge that bordered the narrow dirt road. Their breaths came in shallow, nervous gasps as they peered through the thick foliage toward the small wooden house ahead. Inside, a faint golden light flickered behind the curtains, casting long shadows on the walls. Then she appeared, a figure of unearthly beauty. Daisy, the daughter of the infamous Mr. Grimm, moved gracefully across the room. Her long dark hair cascaded like a waterfall down her back, her every movement captivating and serene. To Clay she seemed otherworldly, like a goddess trapped in a mortal shell. "Look at her," Clay whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "Martin, have you ever seen anything or anyone so beautiful?" Martin nudged him sharply. "Quiet, you idiot. If her father catches us here, we'll regret it." Clay ignored the warning, his eyes glued to the glowing figure inside. "I don't care. She's worth it. I'll do whatever it takes to make her mine." Martin rolled his eyes, shifting uncomfortably. "You don't know what you're saying. That man, Mr. Grimm, he's not just strange. People say he's dangerous. They say his wife, she didn't die naturally. And Daisy, she's not normal." Clay. The word sent a chill down Clay's spine, but he refused to let fear take hold. "She's perfect," he whispered, more to himself than to Martin. "A girl like that deserves to be with someone who appreciates her, someone who can take her away from whatever this is." "Whatever this is," Martin hissed, his voice rising slightly. "It's her life, Clay. And her father isn't someone to mess with. People avoid their family for a reason. Do you even know what they say about them?" "Stories, superstitions," Clay muttered dismissively, though a flicker of doubt crept into his voice. Martin leaned closer, his face pale under the moonlight. "Not just stories. Old man Grimm people say he consorts with spirits, dark ones. Some even say Daisy isn't his daughter at all, but something he summoned. They say she's cursed." Topic Clay snapped, louder than he intended. His words hung in the air, and both men froze, holding their breath. The soft glow from the house continued undisturbed, and Clay exhaled in relief. "Cursed or not," he said after a moment, "she's the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. And I'm not going to let some old man's reputation scare me off." Martin shook his head. "You're insane. Just look at her from here and leave it at that." But Clay was already scheming, his heart pounding not with fear but with reckless determination. He couldn't explain it. Something about Daisy called to him, a magnetic pull he couldn't resist. As they crouched in silence, Daisy moved toward the window. The soft lamplight illuminated her face fully for the first time, and Clay's breath caught in his throat. She was smiling, but her expression was tinged with something he couldn't quite place: sadness. "Loneliness. She's trapped," he whispered. "What?" Martin hissed. "She's trapped here, Martin. She doesn't belong in that house, in this village. I can see it in her eyes. I have to save her." "You're delusional," Martin retorted, but there was an edge of unease in his voice now. He couldn't deny the eerie beauty of Daisy's smile or the unnatural stillness of the air around them. Suddenly a shadow moved in the dim light of the house. A tall, imposing figure stepped into view. Mr. Grimm. His features were hidden, but his presence was enough to make both young men shrink back into the hedge. He stood motionless, as if sensing something amiss. "We need to go," Martin whispered urgently, tugging at Clay's sleeve. Clay hesitated, his gaze lingering on Daisy one last time. Then, as if sensing their eyes on her, Daisy turned her head toward the hedge. Her gaze pierced the darkness, locking onto Clay's. Time seemed to freeze. Her eyes, impossibly deep and luminous, bore into his soul. Clay felt an inexplicable connection, a tether that bound him to her. "Clay," Martin hissed again, shaking him. "Come on." The spell broke, and Clay stumbled back, his heart hammering. "What?" The two young men scrambled away, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt. As they reached the safety of the main road, Martin rounded on Clay. "Are you out of your mind? Did you see the way her father looked? He knows we were there." Clay barely heard him. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Daisy, her beauty, her sadness, the unspoken plea in her eyes. "I have to see her again," he murmured. "Clay, listen to me," Martin said, gripping his friend's shoulders. "This isn't a game. That family, they're not like us. Stay away from her." But it was too late. The allure of Daisy had already sunk its claws into Clay's heart, and nothing, not warnings, not fear, not even the shadowy figure of Mr. Grimm could stop him now. In the stillness of the night, a faint sound echoed behind them. It was a low, guttural laugh, cold and humorless. Both men froze, a hair on their necks standing on end. "Did you hear that?" Martin whispered. Clay nodded, his face pale. Neither of them spoke as they hurried back to the village, but both felt the same thing, an invisible force watching, waiting, and silently daring them to return. Part 2. A terrifying encounter. The world around them seemed to hold its breath as Clay and Martin crouched behind the dense hibiscus hedge. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp soil, the faint rustle of leaves brushing against their skin. From their concealed position, they could still see the faint glow of Daisy's silhouette in the house. Clay's heart pounded in his chest, a blend of excitement and nervous anticipation. Martin, however, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the edges of his mind. "You've seen enough," Martin whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "Let's get out of here before something happens." Clay didn't respond, his eyes glued to the faint outline of Daisy's figure as she moved inside the house. She was a vision too perfect for the decrepit home she lived in, too radiant for the heavy, brooding presence of her father. To Clay, she seemed like a star trapped in darkness, waiting to be freed. Martin tugged on his sleeve, more insistent this time. "I'm serious, Clay. If her father catches us here before he could finish..." A sharp, guttural cough shattered the silence, cutting through the night like a blade. It wasn't the cough of someone clearing their throat, it was a deep, gravelly sound, full of menace, as if announcing the presence of something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Both men froze. The air grew heavy, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. Slowly, they turned their heads toward the source of the sound. There, just beyond the hedge, stood a tall, shadowy figure. The moonlight barely touched him, but it was enough to outline his angular frame. His shoulders were broad, his stance rigid, and though his face was obscured by shadow, the intensity of his glare was palpable. It was Mr. Grimm. "You boys have a lot of nerve," his voice rumbled, low and gravelly, like the distant growl of thunder. "Sneaking around my property in the dead of night." Clay's breath hitched, his throat dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Beside him, Martin gripped his arm tightly, his fingers trembling. We didn't mean any harm," Martin stammered, his voice shaking. "We were just spying," Mr. Grimm interrupted, stepping closer. His boots crunched against the gravel path, each step deliberate and heavy, sending chills down their spines. "Watching my daughter like a pair of wolves stalking a lamb." "No," Clay blurted, finding his voice. "It's not like that. You just..." What Mr. Grimm's tone was icy, laced with contempt. His face was still hidden, but the gleam of his eyes in the darkness was enough to make their blood run cold. "Do you think I don't know what happens to boys like you who don't listen to warnings?" The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. A cold wind swept through the hedge, carrying with it the faintest scent of something acrid and metallic. It wasn't just fear that gripped them now, it was the overwhelming sensation that they had stumbled into something far darker than they had imagined. "We're sorry," Martin said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll leave. Right now. We won't come back. I swear." Mr. Grimm tilted his head slightly, as if considering their words. The movement was slow, almost animalistic. Then he took another step forward, and the faint light of the moon illuminated his face for the first time. It was a face etched with years of hard living, the lines deep and jagged like cracks in stone. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and his eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. There was something about them, something not quite human, that made both men take an involuntary step back. "I don't just want your word, Mr. Grimm said softly, dangerously. "I want your fear. Fear is what keeps foolish boys like you alive. And if you don't leave now," he paused, letting the threat linger, his gaze boring into theirs. "Well, let's just say you'll wish you had." Clay felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His legs trembled, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he was rooted to the spot, held captive by the sheer malevolence radiating from the man before him. "Go," Mr. Grimm said suddenly, his voice rising to a near roar. Now the command snapped them out of their paralysis. Without another word, Clay and Martin turned and bolted, their feet pounding against the dirt road as they sprinted away from the house. The night seemed to close in around them, the shadows deeper, the air colder. Behind them, Mr. Grimm's laughter echoed, a low, chilling sound that seemed to follow them long after they had left the property. By the time they reached the safety of the main road, both men were gasping for air, their chests heaving. Martin doubled over, his hands on his knees, while Clay leaned against a tree, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" Martin demanded, his voice shaking. "Did you see his eyes, Clay?" There was something wrong with him. Clay didn't answer. His mind was racing, replaying the encounter over and over. There was no denying the danger they had just faced, but beneath the fear, a stubborn determination burned within him. Daisy was worth the risk. She had to be. "I'm not giving up," he said finally, his voice steady, despite the terror still coursing through him. Martin stared at him, incredulous. "You're insane. That man is dangerous, Clay. You saw what I saw. You heard him. We're lucky to be alive," maybe Clay admitted, his gaze distant. "But I can't let this go. Not yet." Martin shook his head in disbelief. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Clay said again, his voice softer this time. "But she's worth it." As the two men made their way back to the village, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. And though neither of them would admit it, they both felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them from the darkness, a silent reminder of the man they had dared to cross and the terrible consequences that awaited them if they ever returned. Part 3. An irresistible obsession. The village seemed quieter than usual as Clay stumbled back home, the events of the night replaying in his mind. The eerie glare of Mr. Grimm's eyes, the growl of his voice, and that unsettling laughter haunted him. But even more vivid than the fear was the image of Daisy, her ethereal beauty, her glowing presence framed by the dim light of her house. She wasn't just a fleeting obsession now, she had become an anchor in his thoughts, pulling him deeper into an abyss he couldn't escape. Clay sat on the edge of his rickety bed, staring out the small window of his room. The moonlight cast long shadows on the wooden floor, and his room felt suffocatingly silent. He clenched his fists, frustration building with every breath. How could he let her slip away so easily? How could he allow fear to control him? "No," he muttered to himself, his voice breaking the stillness of the night. "I have to let her know how I feel. She deserves to know." The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became. Daisy wasn't like anyone he had ever met. Her eyes carried a sadness he couldn't ignore, a silent plea for someone to see her, truly see her. He believed he was that person. No matter what Mr. Grimm said or did, Clay felt it was his duty to reach her. He grabbed an old notebook and tore out a page, the rough edges catching on his fingers. His hand trembled as he picked up a pencil, but he steadied it, determined to find the right words. After a moment of hesitation, he began to write, "Daisy, I don't know how to say this, but I can't stop thinking about you. You're the most beautiful person I've ever seen, and I know there's more to you than anyone understands. I want to know you, to help you, to be there for you. If you feel the same, even just a little, please let me know. I'll be waiting. Clay." He read the note over and over, his heart pounding louder with each pass. It was simple, maybe too simple, but it felt honest. Folding the note carefully, he slid it into his pocket and stood up. The floor creaked beneath his weight as he moved to the door. Martin nearly jumped out of his skin when Clay banged on his window. "What the hell, Clay? Do you know what time it is?" Clay grinned, though his face was pale with exhaustion. "I need your help," no, Martin said flatly, shaking his head. "Whatever it is, the answer is no. You don't even know what I'm asking. I don't need to," Martin shot back. "If it's about Daisy or her lunatic father, I'm out." Clay sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know last night was intense, but this is different. I just need you to deliver this note to her window." "That's it?" Martin stared at him, incredulous. "Are you insane? Do you want me to get killed? Because that's what's going to happen if Mr. Grimm catches me anywhere near their house." "He won't," Clay said quickly, trying to sound confident. "It'll be quick. You slip the note under the window and leave. No one will even know you were there." Martin hesitated, his face etched with uncertainty. "Why can't you do it yourself?" "I can't risk being seen," Clay admitted. "If he sees me again, I'm done. But he doesn't know you like that. You're safe," Martin groaned, rubbing his face. "You're insane, you know that. Completely, utterly insane." "Please, Martin," Clay said, his voice softening. "I'm asking you as a friend. I need to do this." After a long pause, Martin finally relented, snatching the note from Clay's hand. "Fine, but if I die, I'm haunting you." The journey to Daisy's house felt like an eternity to Martin. The night air was cold and heavy, every shadow along the path seeming to move and shift with an unnatural life of its own. His footsteps were muffled against the dirt road, but the sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears. When the small house came into view, he froze. The glow of the lamp inside was faint, but it was enough to outline the familiar silhouette of Daisy. For a moment, Martin understood why Clay was so obsessed. There was something otherworldly about her, something that felt both enchanting and dangerous. Swallowing hard, he crept closer, careful to stay hidden. The hibiscus hedge loomed ahead, and he crouched low, his breath shallow. He could see the window now, slightly ajar. "Just slip it under the window and leave," he whispered to himself. Quick and easy, his hands trembled as he reached into his pocket for the note. Just as he was about to place it under the window, a faint sound behind him made him freeze. It was a low, raspy exhale, like the breath of something ancient and unseen. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. "Hurry up, Martin," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He slipped the note under the window and bolted, his heart racing. He didn't stop running until he was halfway back to the village. The image of those shifting shadows burned into his mind. Back in his room, Clay waited anxiously, pacing the floor. When Martin finally burst through the door, out of breath and pale, Clay rushed to him. "Well," Clay demanded. "Did you do it?" Martin nodded, collapsing onto a chair. "It's done." "But you owe me, Clay." Big time, Clay grinned, relief washing over him. "Thank you. I won't forget this." Martin shook his head, his expression grim. "I hope she's worth it, Clay, because something about that place, it's not right." Clay ignored the warning, his mind already racing with anticipation. He couldn't wait to hear from Daisy, to know if she felt the same way. The next morning, Clay found a piece of paper tucked under his door. His heart leapt as he unfolded it. Recognizing the elegant handwriting immediately, "Meet me at the old oak tree at midnight." His breath caught in his throat. It was happening. She wanted to meet him. For a brief moment, excitement overtook fear, and he felt invincible. But as the day wore on, a sense of unease began to creep in. The note was too simple, too direct, and the oak tree, everyone in the village knew it was a place of whispers and superstition, a place to be avoided after dark. Still, Clay's resolve didn't waver. No matter what lay ahead, he would go. For Daisy, he would face anything, even the unknown. Part 4. A Midnight Invitation. The next morning, the village was bathed in an eerie calm. The chirping of birds sounded distant, muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Clay stirred in his bed, his mind still clouded by the previous night's adrenaline and hope. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. Then his eyes fell on the small piece of paper lying on the floor near the door. His heart quickened as he grabbed it, unfolding it with trembling hands. The handwriting was delicate, elegant, unlike anything he had ever seen. "Meet me at the old oak tree at midnight." The words were simple, but they ignited a fire within him. She had written back. Daisy had noticed him, responded to him. His lips curved into a triumphant smile, but even as excitement coursed through his veins, a tiny flicker of unease gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The old oak tree. It wasn't just any meeting spot, it was a place that carried a weight of fear in the village, a place people whispered about but rarely mentioned aloud. The tree stood at the edge of the village, its gnarled branches twisting against the sky like skeletal hands. It was ancient, older than any living memory, and shrouded in legends that spoke of spirits and curses. But Clay dismissed these thoughts with a wave of his hand. Stories, that's all they were. Daisy had chosen this spot for a reason, and he wasn't about to let fear get in the way. He spent the day restless, pacing back and forth in his small room. His mind raced with possibilities. What would he say to her? How would he explain what he felt? Could she possibly feel the same way? By the time the sun began to set, his excitement had completely overtaken his fear. He rummaged through his wardrobe, pulling out the cleanest shirt he owned. He even combed his hair, something he rarely bothered with, and checked his reflection in the cracked mirror. He looked nervous but determined. The clock struck 11 and the village was cloaked in darkness. The streets were deserted, the air heavy and still. Clay stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. He glanced around, half expecting someone to stop him, to question where he was going. But the village slept soundly, oblivious to his secret rendezvous. The walk to the oak tree felt longer than he remembered. The closer he got, the quieter the world seemed. The sounds of nocturnal animals faded, leaving only the crunch of his footsteps on the dirt path. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting long, distorted shadows. Finally, the tree came into view. It loomed ahead, massive and ancient, its twisted branches reaching toward the heavens. The ground beneath it was bare, the roots protruding like veins from the earth. It looked more like a sentinel than a tree, guarding something unseen. Clay hesitated for a moment, the weight of the place pressing down on him. The air was colder here, heavier, and his breath formed faint clouds as he exhaled. He shook his head, forcing himself to move forward. This was for Daisy. As he reached the base of the tree, he scanned the area. She wasn't there. His heart sank briefly, but he quickly dismissed his doubt. Perhaps she was just running late. He leaned against the rough bark, shoving his hands into his pockets to keep them warm. The minutes stretched on, and the silence grew oppressive. Clay's confidence began to waver. What if this was a mistake? What if she wasn't coming? Then he heard a faint rustling in the distance. His heart leapt as he straightened, his eyes scanning the darkness. The sound grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Daisy. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, her pale skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her dress flowed like liquid silk, and her hair cascaded around her shoulders. But there was something different about her now, something almost otherworldly. "You came," she said softly, her voice like a melody carried on the wind. "Of course," Clay replied, his voice catching in his throat. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. "I couldn't stay away," she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They seemed distant, almost sad. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her tone tinged with sorrow. Clay froze, confusion washing over him. "What do you mean? You're the one who asked me to meet you here." Her gaze shifted, and for a moment she looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to appear. "I didn't want to," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I had no choice." "What are you talking about?" Clay asked, a growing sense of unease creeping into his chest. Before she could answer, a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending shivers down Clay's spine. The branches of the oak creaked and groaned, and the air seemed to grow heavier, almost suffocating. Daisy's expression changed. Her sorrow deepened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You need to leave," she said urgently. Before it's too late, Clay reached for her hand, desperation in his voice. "No, I'm not leaving without you. Tell me what's going on. Why are you so afraid?" She pulled away, her movement sharp and almost unnatural. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "He's coming." "Hey, who's coming?" Clay demanded, his voice rising in panic. But before Daisy could answer, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. It wasn't animal, it was something far more menacing, something that seemed to resonate with the very earth itself. Clay turned toward the sound, his blood running cold. A shadow moved among the trees, massive and shifting, its form indistinct but undeniably threatening. "Run!" Daisy screamed, her voice cutting through the night. Clay hesitated for a moment, torn between his instincts and his need to protect her. But when the shadow lunged forward, its form twisting and stretching toward him, he bolted. He ran faster than he ever thought possible, the pounding of his feet drowned out by the roar of the creature behind him. The path blurred before his eyes, and his chest burned with each breath. When he finally reached the edge of the village, he collapsed, gasping for air. The world was silent again, the shadow and the growl gone. But as he looked back toward the oak tree, he saw her Daisy standing beneath its twisted branches, her figure illuminated by the pale light of the moon. And in that moment he realized the truth. She wasn't just a girl, she was something far more dangerous, something tied to the dark legends of the tree. Yet even as fear gripped his heart, one thought remained: he had to go back. For Daisy, he would face the darkness again. Part 5. The Haunting Meeting. The old oak tree stood like a monument to forgotten horrors, its twisted branches clawing at the night sky. Beneath its shadow, the world seemed to lose its vibrancy, the moonlight barely piercing through the thick canopy above. Clay's breath caught as he approached the tree. His heart raced, but not entirely from excitement. There was something oppressive about the air here, something that made each step feel heavier than the last. And then he saw her. Daisy stood beneath the gnarled branches, her pale skin aglow in the faint moonlight. Her white dress shimmered as if woven from the stars themselves, and her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like a silken veil. She looked otherworldly, her beauty almost painful to behold. But as Clay drew closer, he noticed the sorrow etched into her features, the downturned corners of her lips, the distant, haunted look in her eyes. "You came," she said softly, her voice carrying on the wind like a fragile whisper. "Of course," Clay replied, his voice shaky but resolute. "I had to." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it was tinged with sadness. She lowered her gaze to the ground, as though she couldn't bear to look at him. "You shouldn't have." Clay, the word struck him like a blow. "What do you mean?" I thought he stopped, unsure of how to continue. "You wanted me here, didn't you?" She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a moment he felt as though he were drowning. Her gaze was impossibly deep, like staring into an endless ocean of pain and longing. "I did," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But it was a mistake. You don't understand what you've walked into." Clay's confusion gave way to concern. "Daisy, what's going on? Why are you so afraid?" Before she could answer, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. The temperature plummeted, and the surrounding forest seemed to fall silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Clay shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daisy took a step closer to him, her movements slow and deliberate. "You need to leave, Clay," she said, her tone urgent now. "This place. It's not safe. I'm not leaving without you," he insisted, taking a step toward her. "Whatever's going on, we can face it together. Just tell me what's happening." Her expression twisted with anguish, and she shook her head. "It's not that simple. I'm not what you think I am." The word sent a chill down Clay's spine. "What are you talking about? Of course you are. You're Daisy. He faltered, realizing he didn't know how to finish the sentence. Who was she really? Before she could respond, the stillness around them deepened. The air grew thick, heavy, making it hard to breathe. The faint rustling of leaves ceased entirely, and even the insects seemed to vanish. "Do you feel that?" Clay asked, his voice shaking. Daisy nodded, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows. "He's here." "Who?" Clay demanded, panic creeping into his voice. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to the tree behind her, her body tensing, as if bracing for something unseen. "You have to leave. Now." Clay stood his ground, though his legs felt like they might give out beneath him. "I'm not leaving you. Tell me who's here." A low growl echoed through the clearing, deep and guttural, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Clay's blood ran cold. It wasn't the sound any animal should make. It was primal, ancient, and filled with malice. Daisy's eyes widened in terror. "Clay, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "If you stay, you'll die." "I don't care," he shouted, his desperation spilling over. "I'd rather die than leave you here for a brief moment." Her expression softened, and tears welled in her eyes. "You don't understand what you're saying," she whispered. "You don't know what I am." The growl came again, louder this time, and Clay felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The shadows around the tree began to move, twisting and coiling like living things. "Daisy, what is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Her lips quivered, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stepped away from him, retreating into the shadows of the tree. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Wait," Clay called out, reaching for her, but she was already fading into the darkness. The shadows surged forward, and the growl erupted into a deafening roar. Clay stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror as the air around him seemed to come alive. The branches of the oak tree twisted and writhed, their shapes contorting into monstrous forms. And then he saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, massive and grotesque. Its form was indistinct, shifting and flowing like smoke, but its eyes burned with an unnatural light. It towered over him, its presence suffocating, its gaze filled with malice. Clay's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the creature loomed closer. Clay Daisy's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Run!" The sound of her voice jolted him into action. He turned and bolted, his feet pounding against the ground as he fled the clearing. Behind him, the creature roared, its voice shaking the very earth. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the village, his chest heaving and his limbs trembling. When he finally dared to look back, the oak tree was shrouded in darkness, its twisted branches silhouetted against the pale moonlight. But even from this distance he could see her. Daisy stood beneath the tree, her figure barely visible in the shadows. She raised a hand as if to wave, but her movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with sorrow. Clay collapsed to his knees, his mind reeling. He didn't know what he had just witnessed, but one thing was clear: Daisy wasn't just a girl. She was something far more dangerous, something tied to the dark, ancient power of the oak tree. And yet, despite everything, he couldn't abandon her. No matter what it cost, he had to find a way to save her. Part 6. the unveiling of horror. The stillness under the old oak tree was suffocating, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Clay's trembling hand reached out toward Daisy, her ethereal glow still mesmerizing despite the airy atmosphere. His heart pounded in his chest, torn between the fear clawing at his mind and the magnetic pull of the girl before him. She stood motionless, her pale skin shimmering like moonlight on water, her dark eyes unreadable. "Daisy," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the oppressive silence. "I'm here, I'll help you. We'll leave this place together for a fleeting moment." Daisy's face softened, and her lips curved into a faint smile. But as Clay's fingers brushed the fabric of her dress, everything changed. Her smile twisted unnaturally, stretching wider and wider until it was no longer human. Her eyes darkened, the soft glow draining from them, leaving behind hollow pits that seemed to stare into his very soul. A guttural sound escaped her throat, halfway between a growl and a sob, and her body began to convulse. "Daisy," Clay cried, his voice breaking as he stumbled back. But it wasn't Daisy who stood before him anymore. Her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, as she tilted her head unnaturally to one side. The sorrow in her expression had been replaced by something far more sinister, something that froze the blood in Clay's veins. "You shouldn't have come," she rasped, her voice layered with an unnatural echo. The air grew icy, each breath Clay exhaled forming a faint cloud. His surroundings dimmed, the moonlight struggling to penetrate the darkness that seemed to seep from the ground itself. The once sturdy oak tree groaned and creaked, its branches writhing as if alive. The ground beneath his feet began to shift. Clay looked down, his stomach lurching as the dirt trembled and cracked. Thin, gnarled roots snaked their way to the surface, curling and writhing like living creatures. "Daisy, what's happening?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" She didn't answer. Her head twitched sharply, her hollow eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel as though he were being pulled into an abyss. And then they appeared. From the broken earth, pale, spectral hands emerged, their translucent fingers clawing at the ground. They moved with unnatural speed, grasping for Clay's legs. He stumbled backward, but it was too late. One of the hands latched onto his ankle, its touch colder than ice, and he cried out as pain shot through his body. "Let go of me," he screamed, kicking desperately. The hand's grip was unyielding, its strength far beyond anything human. More hands emerged, clawing at him, their nails digging into his skin. They pulled him downward, the loose dirt beneath him giving way as though it had turned to quicksand. "Daisy, help me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. She remained motionless, her twisted smile unwavering. "You shouldn't have come," she repeated, her voice now devoid of any emotion. Clay's knees buckled as the hands dragged him further down. He clawed at the ground, his fingers digging into the cold dirt, but it offered no resistance. The harder he struggled, the deeper he sank. Around him the world seemed to warp. The shadows grew darker, twisting and pulsating like living things. The groaning of the oak tree grew louder, its branches bending impossibly low, as if they were reaching for him. "No," Clay screamed, his voice raw with terror. "I won't go." "Daisy, please," for a moment. Her expression flickered. The twisted grin faltered, replaced by a fleeting glimpse of the girl he had fallen for. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. "Help me," he shouted again, his voice filled with desperation. Something in her seemed to break. Her hands clenched into fists, and she took a hesitant step forward. But before she could reach him, the spectral hands tightened their grip, yanking him down to his waist. The ground closed around him like a living thing, suffocating and relentless. "You can't save him," a new voice said, deep and resonant, echoing from the shadows. Clay's eyes darted around wildly, searching for the source. From the darkness a figure emerged, massive and imposing, its form shifting like smoke yet undeniably solid. Its glowing eyes burned with malevolence, and its presence was suffocating. "This is his fate," the figure continued, its voice dripping with malice. He came where he was not welcome. Now he belongs to the darkness. No, Daisy screamed, her voice filled with anguish. She lunged forward, her hands outstretched toward Clay, but the shadowy figure moved faster. With a wave of its smoky arm, she was thrown back, her body crumpling against the tree. Daisy, Clay cried, his voice choked with fear and rage. The figure turned its attention back to him, its burning eyes narrowing. And now you will join us? The hands pulled harder, and Clay's chest sank below the surface. He thrashed and screamed, his vision blurring as tears streamed down his face. Please, someone help me. From the corner of his eye he saw Daisy stir. She pushed herself to her feet, her movements weak but determined. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment they were filled with something he hadn't seen before: hope. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then louder no, with a sudden burst of energy, she reached out toward him, her fingers brushing against his. The spectral hands recoiled, their grip loosening just enough for Clay to gasp for air. The shadowy figure roared, its form growing larger and more menacing. You cannot defy me, Daisy's face twisted in pain, but she didn't back down. I won't let you take him, she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. Clay felt the ground beneath him stabilize slightly, and he clawed at the surface with renewed determination. Daisy reached for him again, her hands locking around his wrists. Hold on, she cried, pulling with all her strength. The shadow figure lunged toward them, its monstrous form blotting out the moonlight. But just as it reached them, Daisy screamed and a burst of light erupted from her body. The figure recoiled, its roar shaking the earth, and the spectral hands dissolved into mist. Clay collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for breath. His entire body trembled, his limbs weak and unresponsive. When he looked up, Daisy was kneeling beside him, her face pale and drawn. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her expression was one of relief. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Before Clay could respond, the shadow figure reappeared, its form smaller but no less menacing. This isn't over, it hissed, its voice filled with rage. Daisy turned to face it, her body shielding Clay. Go, she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. Run, I'm not leaving you, Clay protested, trying to stand. You have to, she insisted, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I'll hold it back, but you have to go. Please, Clay. Tears blurred his vision as he stumbled to his feet. I'll come back for you, he promised, his voice shaking. Daisy gave him a small, sad smile. I know you will. With one last look, Clay turned and ran, the sound of Daisy's voice and the shadow's roar echoing behind him. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he looked back to see her standing beneath the oak tree, her figure glowing faintly in the darkness. And then she was gone. Part 7. Martin's Cowardly Escape. The forest was unnervingly quiet, its shadows deepened by the faint silver glow of the moon. Martin crouched behind a dense cluster of bushes, his breath shallow and quick. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave, to turn back, to run far from the cursed oak tree. But something kept him rooted in place: curiosity, perhaps, or loyalty to Clay, he didn't know which. From his hiding spot, he could see them, Clay standing beneath the gnarled branches of the tree, and Daisy, her ghostly beauty glowing faintly in the darkness. The air around them seemed to ripple with tension, as though the world itself were bracing for something terrible. This is insane, Martin muttered under his breath, his fingers gripping the rough bark of the tree beside him. Why didn't I stop him? Why didn't I just drag him home? His whispered self-recrimination was cut short by the sound of Daisy's voice, soft but strained. She was warning Clay to leave, to run while he still could. But Clay, stubborn as always, refused to listen. Martin's heart sank as he watched his friend step closer to her, his hand outstretched. And then it happened. Daisy's demeanor shifted so suddenly, so violently, that Martin almost cried out. Her smile twisted into something grotesque, her eyes darkening until they were empty pits of shadow. The air grew cold, and a soundless pressure seemed to press down on the entire clearing. "What the?" Martin whispered, his voice trembling. Before he could process what was happening, the ground beneath Clay began to shift. Cracks spider-webbed through the earth, and spectral hands clawed their way to the surface. They were translucent and gnarled, their movements unnaturally fast as they latched onto Clay's legs. "Help me!" Clay screamed, his voice shattering the stillness of the night. Martin's blood turned to ice. His body froze as he watched the scene unfold, his mind screaming at him to move, to do something, anything. But fear held him captive. The spectral hands multiplied, pulling Clay downward as he thrashed and kicked. His desperate cries echoed through the clearing, each one stabbing at Martin's conscience. "Daisy, please," Clay shouted, his voice raw with panic. Daisy's expression flickered, a brief glimmer of the girl Martin had seen before, but it was too late. The shadows surrounding the tree grew thicker, coiling like living things. A deep, guttural roar erupted from the darkness, so loud and inhuman that Martin clamped his hands over his ears. He couldn't take it anymore. The sheer terror of the moment overwhelmed him, and his instincts finally won out. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the forest floor as he fled the clearing. "Clay, I'm sorry," he whispered under his breath, guilt twisting in his stomach. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The forest seemed endless, its trees stretching into blackened silhouettes that loomed over him like silent witnesses to his cowardice. The roar from the clearing still echoed in his ears, though he had long since left it behind. Each shadow seemed to move, each rustling leaf a harbinger of doom. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled over roots and fallen branches. The cold air burned his lungs, and sweat dripped from his brow, despite the chill. He risked a glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see spectral hands reaching for him, but the path behind him was empty. Still, he didn't slow down. "Don't stop," he told himself, his voice hoarse. "Just keep running." Just keep. A branch snapped under his foot, and he went sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his knees and palms as he landed, but he scrambled back to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't dare look back again. When Martin finally burst into the village, the streets were eerily quiet. The warm glow of lanterns spilled from windows, but no one was outside. The familiar sight of home should have brought him comfort, but instead it only magnified his guilt. He staggered to a halt in the center of the square, his legs trembling beneath him. For a moment he simply stood there, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cobblestones. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Images of Clay flashed through his mind, his friend's desperate face, his screams, the way the hands had dragged him into the earth. Martin squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memory, but it was no use. "I left him," he muttered, his voice shaking. "I left him to die hours past," though Martin barely noticed. He remained on the ground, his body racked with shivers. The night stretched on, oppressive and unending, and the weight of his actions pressed heavily on his chest. Eventually, the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon, washing the village in pale light. But the warmth of the sunrise did little to soothe the Martin's frayed nerves. He forced himself to his feet, his legs shaky but functional. There was no point in staying here wallowing in his guilt. He had to do something, anything, to make amends. Martin returned to the edge of the forest, his heart pounding with a mix of determination and dread. The clearing where the oak tree stood was still shrouded in darkness, its twisted branches casting long, skeletal shadows. "Clay," he whispered, his voice trembling. There was no response. The clearing was silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of his friend. But the earth was undisturbed, as though nothing had happened. The cracks and claw marks were gone, erased by whatever malevolent force had claimed Clay. "No," Martin said, his voice breaking. "This isn't right." A faint sound reached his ears, a whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. "Martin." He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was familiar, but it was faint, distorted, as though coming from far away. "Martin, help me, Clay," he called out, his voice tinged with desperation. The whisper came again, fainter this time, and Martin felt his resolve crumble. He couldn't do this. He wasn't brave like Clay. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. He turned and fled once more, the weight of his guilt heavier than ever. The sound of Clay's screams, swallowed by the roar of the cursed forces, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Part 8. The morning after. The first rays of dawn stretched over the village, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink. But despite the serene beauty of the morning, a heavy unease hung in the air, like the aftermath of a storm no one had seen but everyone could feel. The villagers stirred in their homes, drawn from restless sleep by an inexplicable sense of dread. Old Mrs. Green was the first to notice something unusual. On her way to fetch water from the well, she paused, her weathered hands gripping her shawl tightly. The birds that usually filled the air with their morning songs were silent. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving even in the light breeze. She shivered, muttering a prayer under her breath. "Something's wrong," she whispered to herself, her sharp eyes scanning the edge of the forest. It wasn't long before others joined her. One by one, villagers emerged from their homes, drawn together by the same gnawing feeling of unease. Whispers spread among them, hushed but urgent. "Did you hear it last night, that sound?" Like a roar, but not from any animal I've ever known, and the boy Clay. Wasn't he headed toward the oak tree? The mention of the oak tree silenced them. The ancient gnarled tree at the edge of the forest had been the subject of whispered warnings for generations. Tales of curses, restless spirits, and disappearances surrounded it, though none could say for sure where the truth ended and superstition began. A small group of men decided to investigate. Armed with little more than their courage and a few farming tools, they made their way to the clearing. The village children, too frightened to follow, watched from a distance, their wide eyes peering through cracks in fences. As the men neared the clearing, an unnatural chill crept over them. The warmth of the rising sun seemed to falter, unable to penetrate the oppressive shadow that clung to the area. The oak tree loomed ahead, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. And there, at the base of the tree, they found him. Clay's body lay half buried in the cold earth, his limbs contorted as if he'd been desperately trying to claw his way free. His face was frozen in a mask of sheer terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared into the void, as though they had seen something beyond comprehension in his final moments. The men recoiled, some crossing themselves while others simply stood in stunned silence. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the faint breeze, a hollow, mocking contrast to the horror before them. "It's him," one of the men finally whispered, his voice trembling. "It's Clay. What happened to him?" another asked, though no one had an answer. One of the older villagers, a man with a face as weathered as the tree itself, knelt beside the body. He hesitated before reaching out, his hand hovering over Clay's chest, but the cold radiating from the boy's lifeless form made him pull back, his face pale. "This wasn't natural," the old man said, his voice low and grim. "Something evil happened here." The news spread through the village like wildfire. By mid-morning, nearly everyone had gathered near the clearing, though none dared approach the oak tree. Mothers held their children close, and men who prided themselves on their bravery stood with grim expressions, their eyes darting nervously toward the darkened forest. "Where's Daisy?" someone asked, breaking the tense silence. "And her father," another added. Grim. "Has anyone seen them?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Several villagers made their way to the small house where Daisy and Mr. Grimm had lived, but the place was empty. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, revealing a home abandoned in haste. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through broken windows, and the faint scent of something burnt lingered in the air. In Daisy's room, they found a mirror shattered, its jagged pieces reflecting the sunlight in fractured patterns. Her belongings were strewn across the floor, as if someone had ransacked the place or fled in panic. "They're gone," one of the men said, his voice filled with unease. "It's the curse," an old woman whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "That family has always been strange. The grim lineage isn't normal." "Daisy was too beautiful," another added, her voice low. "Too perfect. That kind of beauty doesn't come without a price." And Grimm himself, a younger man, said, "He's always kept to himself. What if he made a deal with something unnatural? What if Daisy wasn't even his daughter?" The villagers exchanged fearful glances, their imaginations running wild. Stories of witches, spirits, and dark pacts filled the air, each one more terrifying than the last. What if Clay was trying to save her? Someone suggested, though the thought brought little comfort. "Save her," the old woman scoffed. "Look at him. Whatever he tried to do, it cost him his life. And if Daisy and her father are gone," she trailed off, shaking her head. "They're not gone," the old man from before said, his voice cutting through the chatter. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face grim. "Not entirely. That tree, it holds their secrets. And it holds Clay now." Two the villagers decided to bury Clay at the edge of the forest, far from the oak tree, but still within sight of its ominous silhouette. No one wanted to venture too close to the cursed ground. As the men lowered his body into the shallow grave, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the forest itself were watching. The villagers stood in solemn silence, their heads bowed. "Rest in peace, boy," one of the men murmured, though his words sounded hollow. When the grave was filled, the villagers dispersed quickly, each eager to return to the safety of their homes. But even as they went about their day, the shadow of the oak tree lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of the darkness that had claimed one of their own. That night, as the village settled into uneasy sleep, a single figure stood at the edge of the forest. Martin, his face pale and drawn, stared at the oak tree in the distance. He had returned to the village at sunrise, but he hadn't spoken a word to anyone about what he had witnessed. "I'm sorry, Clay," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I should have done more. I should have saved you." The wind carried his words away, offering no solace. In the distance, the oak tree stood silent and unyielding, its twisted branches silhouetted against the starless sky. And though the village would try to move on, the shadow of that cursed tree and the memory of what had happened beneath it would haunt them all for generations to come. Part 9. The Eternal Haunting. The village was never the same after that fateful night. Though the days passed and seasons changed, an unshakable darkness seemed to linger, creeping into the hearts of its people. The oak tree at the forest edge became a forbidden place, its shadow growing longer and darker as the years wore on. No one dared to approach it, not even during the brightest hours of daylight. But the stories didn't stop. Whispers began to spread among the villagers, soft at first, like the murmur of wind through the trees. Children claimed to see a pale figure in the forest, her long hair flowing like a shadow against the moonlit canopy. Farmers working near the edge of the woods swore they heard her voice, soft, beckoning, yet filled with sorrow. It didn't take long for these whispers to evolve into tales of terror. The first victim. It started with a boy named Samuel, barely 16, who had grown tired of hearing the older villagers speak in hushed tones about the cursed tree. His friends dared him to venture into the forest, to stand beneath the oak and prove that the stories were nothing more than frightened imaginings. Samuel accepted the challenge with bravado, laughing off their warnings. "It's just a tree," he said. "And Daisy? She's just a story." But when Samuel didn't return that night, the village grew tense. Search parties were formed at dawn, men armed with torches and tools venturing cautiously into the woods. They found him lying at the base of the oak tree. Samuel's lifeless body was contorted, his face frozen in a grimace of unspeakable terror. But around him the ground was disturbed, claw marks etched deep into the soil. Though the men refused to speak of what they saw, One whispered of the faint scent of decay and the feeling of being watched, even in the empty clearing. He wasn't alone, the man said, his voice trembling. After Samuel, no one doubted the stories anymore. Daisy's lament. The villagers began to claim they heard Daisy's voice on quiet nights when the wind was still. It was said to drift through the village, soft and mournful, calling out names. Help me, don't leave me here. Her words were always the same, tinged with despair that sent shivers down the spine. Some said her voice was so beautiful it was impossible to resist, like a lullaby meant to draw you into the darkness. But those who followed it never returned. Children were warned to stay indoors after sunset. The mere mention of Daisy's name became taboo, spoken only in whispers by candlelight. Even so, the villagers couldn't escape the feeling that she was always watching, her presence woven into the fabric of their lives. The legends grow. Over time, the rumors grew more elaborate. Some claimed that Daisy's spirit wasn't bound to the oak tree, but roamed the entire forest, watching from the shadows. Others swore they had seen her standing in the village square, her pale figure illuminated by moonlight, only to vanish the moment they blinked. She's waiting, the old women would say, their voices trembling, waiting for the foolish, the curious, the ones who think they can save her. The story of her father, Mr. Grimm, also took on a life of its own. He was said to have made a pact with the spirits that haunted the oak tree, offering his daughter as a sacrifice in exchange for power or perhaps immortality. No one knew the truth, but the house they had once lived in remained untouched, its windows broken and its walls rotting. It was said that on certain nights a faint light could be seen in Daisy's old room, flickering like the ghost of a memory, a deadly trap. As the years passed, travelers and outsiders began to hear of the cursed village. Some dismissed the stories as superstition, but others were drawn by morbid curiosity. They came in search of the infamous oak tree, eager to test the legends for themselves. They never returned. The villagers spoke of seeing shadows moving toward the tree at dusk, figures they didn't recognize. On more than one occasion, the faint sound of a woman's laughter echoed through the forest, light and melodic, but with an edge of malice that made their skin crawl. One traveler, a young woman, was said to have survived an encounter with Daisy. She stumbled back into the village at dawn, her clothes torn and her face streaked with tears. She smiled at me, the woman whispered, her voice hollow. She held out her hand and smiled. But her eyes, they weren't human. They weren't. The woman refused to speak of what had happened after that, and she left the village the next day, never to return. A warning to all. The villagers eventually erected a crude fence around the forest edge, a symbolic barrier to keep the curious and the foolish away, but they knew it was only a gesture. The true danger wasn't the tree itself, it was the allure of Daisy's voice, the pull of her beauty, and the whispers of salvation that drew people in. She was cursed, they would say, and now she curses us. The elders began to weave Daisy's story into a cautionary tale, told to children as a warning: never let curiosity lead you into the unknown. Never ignore the old stories, no matter how fantastical they seem. She'll call to you, they would say, their voices low and trembling. And if you answer, she'll take you, just like she took Clay and all the others, the eternal shadow. Generations later, the village remains haunted by the legend of Daisy and the oak tree. Though the whispers have softened and the details have faded with time, the fear persists. The tree still stands, its massive form casting a shadow over the forest. On moonlit nights, some say they can still see her, standing beneath its branches, her pale figure glowing faintly. And if you're quiet, very, very quiet, you might hear her voice. Help me, don't leave me here, but if you hear her, remember the warnings of the villagers. Turn away, run. Because once you answer her call, there's no escaping the eternal haunting of the cursed oak tree.